Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, where we'll be discussing how funders can support local solutions. I'm Catherine Cheney, a senior reporter for Devex, covering the role of the West Coast in international development, plus technology and philanthropy more broadly, and I'll be your moderator today. Before we get started, I just want to do a quick sound check. So if you are able to hear me, can you please type a quick yes in the Q&A box on your screen? I'll wait for a few of those yeses to come in. All right, looks like we are good. Great, let's get started. So if at any point you do have technical issues, please just send us a message in the Q&A box, and we will do our best to assist you. So the field of philanthropy has come under scrutiny over the past year. This session really builds on some of the conversation at the Skull World Forum earlier this month in Oxford. And at the Skull World Forum, I moderated a panel where I asked who felt that philanthropy was in a moment of reckoning, and nearly everyone in the room raised their hand. So there was a lot of thoughtful conversation around the way forward. And one criticism is the fact that many of the people engaged in philanthropy are often far removed from and lack the experience and perspective of the people directly impacted by the problems they're trying to solve. So increasingly, leaders in philanthropy are thinking about ways to make this shift from funding from afar to supporting local solutions. And today, we'll hear from leaders on how to do just that. So today, you're going to hear from DASRA, India's leading strategic philanthropy foundation, Co-Impact, a new model for collaborative philanthropy that's dedicated to supporting systems change, and the Chandler Foundation, a philanthropic organization that supports social entrepreneurs, started by Richard Chandler, a core partner in Co-Impact. They'll share their own approaches to giving and also provide some insights on ways others, including many of you, can close the distance between themselves and the solutions they seek to support. And we'd also love to incorporate your perspectives, so please make sure to submit your questions at any time using the Q&A box. And then after our presenters each present, we'll try to respond to as many questions as possible. So I want to kick things off with Neera Nundy, co-founder and partner at DASRA. Thanks, Neera.
Thanks, Catherine, and welcome everyone, and hello from Mumbai in India, and thank you for having me, and it's a real privilege actually to also hear from Tim and Rakesh, and I hope that I can just cover a bit of a perspective from DASRA, which I'm not going to go through the entire slide, which a lot of you see there, but I think what I wanted to shift the conversation even as we kick off is I think our challenge is not just how do funders fund local solutions, but how do local funders fund local solutions. And if we look at India as a case and country in point where, you know, we rank so low on the SDGs yet and so high on prevalence, if we can actually shift the needle in India very specifically with local solutions, we're going to see sort of an uptick in improvement at a global level on the SDGs. So the relevance of India's movement towards addressing these issues is actually very important as part of the global agenda. And so you'll find a lot of funders are beginning to pull out of India. And so there is even, especially if we think of overseas development assistance as India is a middle-income country, there are sort of questions around, you know, if there is the economic trickle-down effect, then shouldn't most of our population benefit sort of from that, which is a bit of what the next slide really looks to project. And I think what this is trying to see is that we're not going to be able to solve the problems for, you know, what starts off at the bottom of the pyramid and moves towards the bottom of the diamond with simply an economic model, even though there will be high growth here. And so an even stronger case for thinking about solutions at scale when you've got 330 million people that need to have a lot of these SDGs solved for them. And so the larger question for us in India, and I think even at scale in other countries, is therefore kind of what's the role of philanthropy in this? And in the grand scheme of being able to solve this issue, the kinds of numbers are around $60 billion, which, if we think about what's moving in from private funding locally, we're still only, and I'm sorry, these are in rupee numbers, we're still only between a $6 to a $10 billion that's going to come from private funding. And the reason that this is important to highlight is there's two aspects. To really address, these problems at scale, you're going to need private philanthropy, you're going to need the government to engage as well as the private sector. And so to ask ourselves what's the role of the funder, I think it is to begin to build and leverage other probably deeper pockets to actually meet this resource requirement. And of course, I'm not even addressing that the issue isn't money. It's also organizations, where they are in their capabilities, especially nonprofits, for them to absorb funding but actually solve these problems at scale. The next slide kind of just speaks to, even if we do a deeper dive into the current wealth in the country, because there is quite a lot of conversation around wealth creation in India, and therefore can local wealth solve the local problems with local solutions? I think to some extent, yes, but even when we dig deeper, that's actually not enough. And so that kind of brings me to towards the end of the slide, which is a bit more of our challenge is not only local solutions, but how are we addressing these solutions at an aggregate level? And so, for example, we focus on adolescent girls or urban sanitation. I think our movement and investment in individual organizations needs to now look at a collaborative way of not only giving, but how are organizations at an aggregate level working with each other, and where are their sort of measurable results. And so what we've tried to place here is encouraging folks to begin to think about a field approach. So it's not about funding one local solution. It's a range of solutions that begin to move the field. And I'll just end with, these are some of the pillars we're seeing that are important as we begin to shape our philanthropy around a field approach, which is really focusing on outcomes and building some of that capability around measurement with these organizations and with the sector is what we also need to focus on. And then before there, you can kind of see on the slide, which is using data to engage with the government, really bringing other stakeholders in. And I think solutioning with the intent and design around scale. And I think where we have done a great job as nonprofits is you build almost incrementally. And so we've been around for 20 years. And I ask myself, I can't believe it's taken us so long to get to this point, and I'm not sure we ourselves as DUSRA actually designed for scale. But there are leaders, and probably, Tim, you probably can speak to this better than I can, that if you begin your journey with that intent and design, I feel that that solution has to be designed for scale. But these are just some thoughts to open with.
This is great. Thanks, Mira. And I know we're going to move to Q&A later in today's webinar, but just one quick follow-up question. I'm wondering if you could share with us how these pillars and these approaches translate to a particular project. So could you just share with us, one of the examples at DOSRA of something you've supported taking this approach and the kind of impact you've seen?
Yeah, sure. So one of our collaboratives is called 10 to 19 Adolescent Collaborative, and it's about focusing very clearly on four outcomes that can empower adolescent girls. And what we've seen, the benefit of anchoring a collaborative or this field approach around outcomes such as delaying child marriage, delaying first pregnancy, completing secondary school, and building agency and employability. These four outcomes are at the forefront and core of the collaborative that actually can build and engage a range of stakeholders. And so what we were able to do is pool funds. And I'm sure Rakesh will speak to the power of pooling with co-impact. But I think in this case, the Adolescent Collaborative, our challenge is a lot of the funding is quite sector specific. So folks will call themselves, we fund education, we fund health, we fund skills development. What this collaborative fund enables is the pooling of different kinds of money that then actually when it goes out to support the nonprofits, on the ground with their scaling plans, they have the flexibility and unrestricted funding to actually grow their interventions in a comprehensive way. And so we're trying to strengthen outcome-led funding in the adolescent girls space, but given the maturity, it's a bit harder to build a social impact bond or pay for performance. And so right now it's about strengthening these 7 organizations actually that we're funding at a state level. And the idea is that they saturate at a district. So to achieve scale, you need to work with the government, but you also need to work with the government to show that you're going to saturate districts or states, which is a unit level of a state in India. And so we're funding nonprofits to achieve these outcomes over the next 5 years with the idea that they will work and directly improve the lives of about 5 million adolescent girls. And that 5 million in a particular state, the idea is that becomes a replicable model, and you begin to measure what aspects are working and what's not. And the idea is you share that with a community of practice, which is an underlying platform to this collaborative. I don't know if that helps, Catherine.
Absolutely. No, thank you so much. And I'm sure we'll return to some of that in the Q&A, but just wanted to make sure we could picture an example as we talk through this. And as you can see here in the last link from Neera's presentation, you can find out more in this India Philanthropy report. But thank you so much, Neera, for sharing, and we'll come back to you in the Q&A. I see one question that I'll just quickly answer because it was from Neera's presentation. There was the acronym UHNI, and someone asked, what is UHNI? So for those of you who are joining a little bit later, I'm Devex's West Coast correspondent based in Silicon Valley, and UHNI is ultra high net worth individuals. I say that because that's a big part of our coverage from the West Coast. These high net worth individuals getting engaged in philanthropy and in issues like those captured in the Sustainable Development Goals. And so DASRA is working with systems change in philanthropy in India and often with UHNIs. So we'll come back to more questions in the Q&A. Please keep them coming. But thanks so much for that, Neera. And now I want to hand it over to Rakesh Rajani, who I mentioned earlier is the Vice President of Programs at Co-Impact, to hear more about the co-impact model, especially as it relates to this question of how funders can support local solutions. So Rakesh, over to you.
Thank you, Catherine, and hello all. I'm really glad to be on this webinar together with Neera and Tim. I think we learn a lot from them every time. I thought I would share kind of 2 stories around failure because I think we can learn a lot from failure. They stink and can sometimes concentrate the mind, and then turn to 5 lessons and what we think we can get right, and then end with a conclusion. So first, two stories from my part of the world. I now live in New York, but I'm from East Africa, from Tanzania. The first story is about play pumps. It's a famous story that some of you will have heard in Mozambique, where somebody came up with this brilliant idea of, we have a problem where kids don't get time to play or equipment to play, and we also need water, particularly that women are responsible for. So what if we kind of turn the kind of merry-go-round where you push kids that they can have fun, and that in effect pumps water up into the tank that you can see. You solve 2 problems at one time, you have a lot of fun, you got a lot of publicity and a lot of money, and a lot of people got excited about this idea. Turned out though, despite all the great press, the idea quickly fizzled out and it did not work. Many of these merry-go-rounds, like the one you see in this photograph, ended up being abandoned. The water problem was not solved, and the whole project in many ways completely failed. To their credit, the people who organized this work did admit the failure and kind of spoke openly about the lessons they learned. So why did it fail? It failed because first, there were technical problems. The water was not, in order for this to work, the water needed to be near the surface. It often wasn't. The quality of the water was often poor, so when they got it, it wasn't drinkable. The project assumed that women were just available all the time to be pushing these merry-go-rounds, when in fact women's time was a premium. They were very busy. They had lots of things to do. There was also this assumption that, women love kids. They'll love pushing kids around merry-go-rounds. Nobody kind of considered that this would be considered undignified for people to do that, and that they may choose to have other ways of spending their time. And an assumption was also made that children always wanted to play, right? Of course, children love play. but children were not interested in sitting on the merry-go-round. And often you had this problem where children were kind of forced to play when they would rather be doing homework or being quiet or doing something else. And then finally, a lot of the equipment also broke down quickly, and nobody had paid careful attention to the kind of boring but essential tasks of who will maintain this equipment. So these are some of the lessons why this wonderful idea failed. I'll give you one other example of something I was personally involved with myself in Tanzania, where you have a problem where there are many water pumps that were installed but don't function. So we came up with a bright idea of why not equip people to use SMSs on their phone, very simple technology, to report that the water pump was not working. That information would then be shared to the authorities, and the authorities would know then and would come and fix the water pumps. And if they didn't, this would also be publicized through media, which would put pressure on the governments to make sure it's worked. So this project, once it got underway, we found that it worked technically, but there was an up. The assumption was that maybe the technology hasn't quite worked. All kinds of engineers put a lot of time to kind of make the technology work, and they perfected it, but it still didn't work. The people are just not reporting. There was hardly any uptake. So then we came up with the idea that the problem was communication, that we hadn't actually communicated enough. So lots of energy and time went into really smart communication to let people know about this opportunity, and it still didn't have uptake. So after nothing had worked, we actually took the time to ask the women, who typically were responsible for water, why weren't you using this wonderful new solution that had been set up for you? And long story short, the women said, look, we appreciate what you're trying to do, but this is project number 38 in the last 20 years where people have tried to help us. We've spent a lot of time and we've just wasted it. If we reported this, nobody would take any action. The problem here isn't that the information about these water pumps is not available. The problem here is that the government officials who are responsible for fixing this simply don't have the incentives and the support to do it right. So once you solve that problem, we'll let you know, but don't tell us to send you information when in fact the problem is something else. So the very simple act of asking women, which you would have thought we would have done right from the beginning, gave us the insight as to why this effort was not working. So these two stories of failure teach us a number of simple takeaways. They might sound obvious, but you'd be surprised as to how often many well-meaning people get this wrong. So the first is that the problems we had worked on were defined by experts who did not live in those contexts where we are trying to make the improvements, and they do not understand the nuances of the context in which we are working. Secondly, in both those cases, the people who are working on this were frankly quite blind to the constraints on and the priorities of women. They were male-dominated. There were very few women in positions of power and decision-making, and they simply did not understand the key gender dynamics. Third, while technology can be really helpful, they were so enamored by what technology can do for you, they did not pay enough attention to the actual complexities of the problem or the context. Fourth, we did not listen to the simple act of listen to the people whose lives we were trying to help. We listened to officials, we listened to other people, but we did not listen to people we're trying to help. And finally, our feedback systems. While we had all kinds of feedback systems in the project, they did not, in fact, they were not quick enough and meaningful and systematic enough to again listen to the people whose lives we are trying to improve. So then, how can funders get this right, drawing on the types of lessons that we have here? And here, I'm going to share here 3 sets of ideas that Co-Impact and our funders are struggling with to try to get right, to be able to avoid these sorts of challenges we have. So the first is the very simple act of having the curiosity to ask questions and to listen deeply. And listen not only to what people tell us, but try to listen to the silences. Sometimes you can learn the most when you ask a question and people just look at each other and don't answer. Trying to interpret that is also really, really important. This is what our funders call having a beginner's mindset. How do you do this practically? You take time to do immersions. You take time to just spend, really relaxed time rather than rush time in the context in which we work. More concretely, in our grant-making process, we give a design grant to our program partners, which means they have real resources in a period of between 6 and 8 months to think carefully around their program design before they actually roll that out. And a lot of the time when you do that, you learn all kinds of new things that change how you go about things. And then secondly, I think it's really important. In the US, this initiative is called Listen for Good, is one example of this, to build in systematic and meaningful feedback from the clients you're trying to help into your program, from the beginning and ongoing manner. This is something we are working with all our program partners to do right now, to build in that feedback and to use that feedback to improve things, and then to close the loop by telling people, this is what we've heard, this is what we've learned, this is how we're going to change your practice. The second set of things that our funders are trying to get right is to focus on systems rather than stopgaps, or rather than just the results without addressing the systems, right? So the first is that you need to understand the complexity, but then within the complexity, focus on what matters. So for example, our partners in Liberia, Last Mile Health and the government of Liberia, are focusing on health workers and community health workers, because while there are hundreds of challenges in Liberia, crucial issue of community health workers is key. That insight came from doing work on the ground, whereas people from the outside might have focused on a number of other challenges. Second, a lot of the time things don't work right, not because there's a technical problem, but because we haven't figured out the political economy and governance issues, stuff that I know that Tim is working on a lot as well. So for example, our partner Teaching at the Right Level understands deeply that if we want to solve education in Africa and in India, we need to focus on incentives on leaders and on teachers, as well as motivation. What motivates a district official to do the right thing? Or what motivates the teacher to go into the classroom every day and make sure that they're focusing on learning outcomes? A final example is that you have to really pay attention to power and voice on the ground. It's very hard to do that remotely from a distance. And our partners who are working on the graduation approach or Project ECHO or Cities Rise, they work across very different issues. One is household poverty, another is health, another is mental health in urban settings. But what's common across all of them is they systematically build in meaningful voice and community voice across their program in ways that kind of readdress the power imbalance between them. So final set of ideas that our funders and ourselves we are working on are, how do you structure support to organizations in ways that will enable the organizations to be smarter and more strategic in what they do? So here are a couple of key things that seem, again, obvious, but so important, and unfortunately, these are not the norm, which are, provide long-term funding, avoid cherry-picking pieces you like and not fund things that you don't like, engage and trust. You focus on the outcomes, but you don't micromanage, and then also invest in helping the organizations be strategic and more capable in the long term. Don't just focus on the results you want, also focus on the organizational health that really matters. So in conclusion, I want to just share the kind of key point that I think everything I've said so far shows that what really matters is that it's about relationships. And it's around relationships of trust and mutuality and equality between the funder and the grantee. I would like to end with 5 tips of how do you know you've got it right? How do you know you are in the right relationship as a funder with the grantee? A phrase that we don't really like, we prefer program partner, but I will use grantee here because that's what we're familiar with. The first is the grantee able to set the agenda and the rules of the game as much as the funder, whether it's around reporting frequency, formats, the terms of the contract, what level of details are asked for? Are the grantees able to determine those as much as the funder? Second, does the grantee feel comfortable saying no to us as the funder on issues like how many site visits, or how do you do the site visits, or conference invites that you want the grantee to come to, or when the funder says, hey, can you please do a little more of this because that matters to us? Are they able to say no and explain why they're saying no? Third, are both parties able to say to each other, you know what, I got this wrong, or I'm stumped about this, I don't know what to do. not only the grantee being able to say this to the funder, but also the funder being able to share that same thing to the grantee. Fourth, is the funder, this for me is a key marker. I often ask this to my colleagues and I've asked this to the funders. Can they tell stories of what they have learned from the grantee and how they have consequently changed their practice? And then finally, you know, in relationships, it's not only about just the work. If relationships is also about our whole selves that we bring to work. So if one was to eavesdrop into those conversations, you know, would you hear a good amount of laughter? And would there even be a few corny stories about their families? I think if you get these 5 things, you've gotten it right. Let me stop here.
I love that. Thank you so much. And we'll come back to the co-impact model in the Q&A, I'm sure. I see one question that came in asking if slides will be made available. And yes, they will be, which is good, because otherwise I would be screenshotting everything from this most recent presentation. Lots of useful insights in terms of funders supporting local solutions. And before I introduce our next speaker, I'll just say one of the things I really value about the way that co-impact has come together is making sure to, one, recognize some of the problems with philanthropy that they want to correct for and try to do better on. And I think we've just heard some great examples of that. 2, involving people in the process who have been doers. So in this field of philanthropy and social entrepreneurship, it's often described as donors and doers. And both Rakesh and Tim, who we'll hear from in just a moment, you know, they've been doers for a long time in this space and are now working on the donor end. And I think they bring really valuable perspectives to the work. So with that, moving on to the next slide here, I'd love to go ahead and introduce Tim Hanstad, who leads the Chandler Foundation.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. It's a real pleasure and honor to be with the group this morning. I'm not sure how much I can add to what Neera and Rakesh have already richly provided. But I do think this topic is very important in large part because there is a misalignment between where the majority of global philanthropic resources lie and where they need to be spent in to effectively address many of the world's biggest challenges. That itself is something important to recognize, and it's also, I think, you started, Catherine, by saying that philanthropy is at a moment of reckoning, and I agree with that. And I agree with it because I think a lot of the important questions about power dynamics and about privilege that have existed for a long, long time are now being asked in a bigger way, and which I think is extremely helpful for the sector. It's extremely helpful because I think for a long time many people have existed in the sector thinking that if you just have good intentions, that might be enough. And from my experience, I've seen that's never enough. And in fact, that good intentions without recognition of these power dynamics, without understanding what the problem is as perceived by the primary stakeholder, those you're trying to actually help, can actually cause harm. And so what does participation look like? What does localizing look like? Actually, Neera and Rakesh already hit on it well. I have learned over the years largely from failure, frankly. And so many of the lessons that I have learned and continue to learn, by the way, I think if we ever get to the point where we think our learning is largely done, we're in a very dangerous place. But one of my learnings was that it's not primarily about recognizing that a solution that has worked in a particular place will work in another place. I mean, that is a problematic assumption, but it goes further than that. It goes to defining what the problem is that you are trying to address and understanding that problem as it's perceived by those you're trying to help. Because I have found many cases that we define the problem differently, and that if you actually go to and spend time with and are in proximity with those who you're trying to help, that they will actually define the problem in a much different way than you might going in. So framing the problem as your primary stakeholders, I'm calling those we are seeking to help as the primary stakeholders, is, I think, a crucial starting point. And it starts with that mentality that Rakesh described of being a learner, of assuming that the primary stakeholders are going to know much more about the problem and what the potential solution is going to look like than an outsider will coming in. I'll just give you one example that actually is less from my professional life than from my personal life. Is many years ago, my wife and I got involved in as volunteers in working in the city where we lived, Seattle, in inner city neighborhoods, trying to support inner city kids who were dealing with all kinds of challenges that frankly we had never faced in our life. And spending time as a volunteer and watching, assuming that because we were from the outside and maybe had more resources, more education, that we would have a lot to offer, turned out to be not the case. That we learned after some time that it was actually just, again, emphasizing something that Rakesh mentioned, that it was being in relationship with these kids, that it was listening to them and what their lives and their challenges were like. It was about asking the right questions. It was not about coming up with the right solutions oneself, but it was about asking the right questions. So just and over the years saw many people come into the neighborhood from the outlying suburbs, not really in a position to understand, and it was those who would come in with the mentality of I guess the best way to describe it maybe is sometimes called the white savior complex, that we need to go in and help because these poor people can't help themselves and we have answers for them, is really problematic. And that attitude, I think, is very, very common in global development. I think being aware of privilege, being aware of power dynamics, being aware of implicit bias, being aware that while problems in different settings might have some common characteristics, that the solutions are always local specific and that the solutions need to be arrived at through the local actors and through the primary stakeholders. I think you can get at that certainly through relationship. It's often through proximity. It can be through doing research and research in proximity. And by the way, doing desk research from afar, without really getting into people's lives and understanding how they perceive the problems and asking the right questions. It's often just about asking the right questions and coming in with the learner's mind. I saw time and time again, both from mistakes that I made, but also mistakes that others made in trying to define what the problem was, and I'm talking here about my experience at Landesa. If you tried to understand that through desk research or by reading research reports done by other people who weren't really close to the problem, that they often just framed the problems and or the solutions in a way that wasn't appropriate. So I say all of that sometimes when I tell people that who are not locals, who aren't in proximity, but who do have power and resources, they become so dismayed that they think, well, I can't do anything. And I think that actually also is problematic, that we can't go to the other side of the spectrum and throw out the baby with the bathwater, that non-locals can sometimes provide important support, but doing it in all the ways that Neera and Rakesh earlier described, by doing it by asking questions, by starting with the assumption that they're going to know a lot more about both the problem and the solution, and that once you start actually even framing and staffing and identifying leaders that they are close to and understand the problems and the primary stakeholders. I'll stop there, Catherine. I know you wanted to ask some questions.
Sure, I do have some questions for you. No, that was great, and I really appreciate your point when you said don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I feel similarly when we talk about this moment of reckoning philanthropy is in my mind, it's how do we highlight the approaches that make sense and the approaches that can really lead to change. And as you said, non-local funders can provide support, but in all the ways that you and Neera and Rakesh have outlined in this webinar. So I really appreciate that point. A couple questions for you. So one, you mentioned your background with Landesa, which I know has informed your approach to the work that you do now. And I'm curious if you can take me inside some of the conversations at the Skull World Forum around the way forward in this moment as it relates to local solutions. So I'll just quickly say, one of the critiques of philanthropy is captured in a book, Winners Take All. And Winners Take All argues that winners have to take a little bit less. And that's not just donors, but also doers that might have benefited from, networks like the annual Skull World Forum for Social Entrepreneurship. So can you just kind of talk with me about, having come from this world of social entrepreneurship, and Landesa, has been a Skull awardee, and I know the Chandler Foundation supports many champions, as you call them, in the social entrepreneurship space. How have you kind of looked at this moment and talked through it, for example, at the Skull World Forum and beyond?
Well, so interesting that you asked. I actually was part of a discussion among awardees this year in Oxford that took this up in a very significant way and talked about not only talked about the Winners Take All book and the conversation started out mostly as a critique of funders who are in positions of power and don't always recognize those power dynamics. Some would say rarely recognize those power dynamics and the privilege that they have. But it also evolved into a discussion about, and remember these are Skull awardees, that in fact the awardees themselves and their organizations are often in positions of privilege. So it's not just about the donors, it's certainly about the doers. So it's not just a relationship between donors and doers, it's a relationship between doers and those that they aim to serve. And without going into all the details of the conversation, I think the fact that we were having the conversation and that there was some level of awareness, at least of the privilege that we as awardees have. I say we. I'm now on the donor and not the doer side. But I think one of the things that I've often seen about privilege is people when they talk about privilege, they're talking about people that maybe have more power than them without recognizing their own privilege as it relates to others. So it's very easy for doers to complain about donors without necessarily recognizing the privilege that they in fact have. So there is a winners take all kind of critique of doers as well.
That's really well put. In talking with some people at the Skull World Forum about this topic, one thing I heard, and perhaps a powerful call to action for all of us, is taking a look at power in this sector, understanding who has it, who does not, and how to give it up, whether you're a donor, whether you're a doer. And I think we're getting at a lot of that in this talk, so thank you for that. And one other question for you, and then I want to broaden it to Q&A and some of the great questions coming in, so please keep them coming, and we'll get to as many as we can. But one more question for you, Tim. So I know that the Chandler Foundation really brings an investment approach, applies investment principles to its philanthropy. And I ask this question because I see this a lot from Silicon Valley donors, which I'm quite focused on. So bringing this investment background, investment principles to philanthropy. And from your site here, I see, so instead of delivering exponential financial returns, our investments enable our champions to create transformation at scale in communities around the world. I wanted to ask you about this private sector approach to philanthropy. And how it relates to this question of proximity and philanthropy. And I guess where my question is coming from is I recently heard from Phil Buchanan at the Center for Effective Philanthropy, and he was talking about, these private sector analogies to giving. There is some good to that, but one of the risks is this emphasis on scale could overlook scale by many smaller organizations around the world working on the same problem. Often we talk about scale of a single organization. So I guess the question is, when it comes to bringing investment principles to philanthropy, do you think that can threaten proximity in philanthropy, and how do you account for that?
Yes, it can. Well, a couple of points here. One is the point on scale. I think to the extent we're talking about scale, we need to be focused on scaling impact, not scaling organizations. And so scaling impact can certainly involve supporting a number, in fact, should involve supporting a number of organizations working on the same challenge, rather than saying our goal is to support this organization so the organization can scale and define scale in terms of headcount or budget. It is, at the end of the day, I think it's about scaling impact, not scaling organization size. In terms of using investment principles, it's not, so in the case of the Chandler Foundation, I think the Chandler Foundation has done a strong job of using some of the principles used in business investing to social investing. That's not to say that the primary path to impact or greatness in the social sector is to become more like business. In fact, I resonate with Jim Collins' thinking on this. If you've read his Good to Great in the Social Sector, he actually starts with the statement, we must reject the idea, well-intentioned but dead wrong, that the primary path to greatness in the social sector is to become more like a business. But there are principles that come out of financial investing that do have their adaptation and application within social investing. But it's not. I guess it's like it's not like you can just export the whole thing directly to it. It's about disciplined planning and disciplined people and disciplined governance, disciplined allocation of resources, looking very closely at the models that are being used as we do social investing, looking close at the leadership. Is this, as Jim Collins would call it, a level 5 type of leader? And part of that is level 5 type of leader in Jim Collins' definition, I think, is do they have a diffuse kind of leadership style? And part of that is looking at empowering people that are closest to the problem set that they're trying to address, whether that's in business or in the social sector.
Thanks for that. And that's a great segue into one of the questions that came in. And so this question is a reaction to Rakesh's presentation, but I also would love to bring Neera's voice into this as well. And someone wrote in that they think it would be useful to talk about meaningful local voices in decision-making. And this person asked, can you give some examples of how that's been tangibly integrated from a funder's perspective? And maybe as a follow-up, define meaningful. So I think that's a great question. Rakesh, could you just expand when you talk about meaningful local voices in decision-making, how is that integrated into the work of Co-Impact? And then maybe we can bring in Neera on this as well.
Great. Yeah, though I think it's a great question. A lot of it is about who controls the money. Some funders ask for extremely detailed budgets and would want control over how every dollar gets spent. We take a very different view where we have serious strategic conversations and with local leaders, and then once we are convinced that they know, that they are really on the right path, they are kind of rooted and grounded and have amazing decision-making systems and governance systems, we then give them a lot of flexibility to decide how the money is spent. Another thing that is the same goes with plans. One can make the best plans, but things don't always go according to plan. Circumstances change, new challenges or new opportunities crop up. So instead of kind of having a blueprint that we control and that they must follow, instead we ask, what mechanisms do you have in place to course correct, to learn and adapt your practice? And we are much more interested in the local leaders' ability and kind of mechanisms to learn and adapt and change what they're doing, rather than to follow something that we have pre-approved. It also goes in terms of our practice. We ask on a regular basis for feedback on how we are doing and how we can improve, how we can be better supporters. We ask them to criticize us where we've got things wrong, and we try to create the relationship and the environment where people would feel comfortable telling us that, look, even though, as Tim was saying, we mean well, the outcome may actually be more harmful. And then finally, in terms of governance, when we engage we think governance is really important, how an organization is governed, but we're much more interested in not their accountability to us, but rather their accountability to their own constituency. So we ask, for example, with our partners, are there enough women on the board? Do you have, for example, a balanced gender representation? If you're trying to help people who come from the lowest rungs of society, do you have representation from that group? Do you have some different voices who would question the orthodoxy in your own governance? So it's much more around them being accountable to their own constituencies and bringing in fresh and different voices in their own governance rather than being accountable to us. I could go on, but those are some of the examples I would give around how we try to do this sort of local accountability and empowering leaders to make the decisions rather than us making decisions on their behalf.
Thanks so much for that. And Neera, I want to get your thought on this great question about meaningful feedback, but I'm actually just going to throw in one other question that came in that I think you might also want to speak to. So someone asked, can you speak to our role as partners in solutions versus funding and upskilling local primary stakeholders so they can build and support their own solutions? In other words, even if we understand our bias and privilege and try to be conscious of that, does our very active involvement work at a detriment to empowering local solutions? And the reason I want to bring Neera in on this is, so Devex who co-founded Dastra with Neera, was actually on this panel at the Skull World Forum where we were talking about this moment of reckoning, if you will, that philanthropy is in. And he talked about having to build up the confidence of local NGOs and local organizations in India because of some of these dynamics we're describing. So Neera, whether it's that question around meaningful feedback or that question of empowering local solutions and how our involvement might affect that, I'd love to just get your take from Dastra.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the challenge in the power imbalance is also coming from how we as sector leaders lean in and make the ask of funders. I think often we've worked with organizations who are just really happy to have funding because, you know, sometimes they're at a stage they're kind of living from hand to mouth. And we've seen that providing some support to organizations to help them on how do you communicate and how can they exercise that voice with funders, especially playing the organizational lens. So what ends up happening, we found with organizations that they'll often speak project-wise instead of the sort of holistic view of where is the organization going. And I think some of the accountability frameworks have often come from the funder side. And what we're trying to work with organizations and leaders is they should begin to build the accountability framework and have funders fit into that rather than the other way around. But often folks don't take that step back to be able to build out what they see that future as. And I think what we've seen as challenging is that a lot of these successful organizations actually are very local and begin with engaging the community voice. And the first phase of the success of these organizations is often, you know, what we're talking about here. What ends up happening is you then get some of these larger institutional funders that are coming in globally, and all of a sudden the dynamics of this organization begins to change as they move in that scale trajectory. So I think beginning to think about certain phases of the organization and how do you stay locally relevant, I think will require a lot more discipline, structure, and process that's actually being driven from the social enterprise themselves.
Thanks so much. A great question that's come in here on engaging ultra-high net worth individuals, which I think increasingly we'll see new models, small, medium-sized, larger foundations, and even other structures, the rise of LLCs, et cetera, coming from ultra-high net worth individuals. The question is, how does one create the right dialogue with ultra-high net worth individuals to move them from responsive funding to individual organizations to real involvement in social change projects? I think we've heard a few great examples of that, but anything that, and I'd welcome this from Tim or Neera or Rakesh, anyone who wants to jump in. Anything you'd want to add on, okay, if someone's inspired by these three models, what more is needed to ensure that, you know, the growth of ultra-high net worth individuals and philanthropy corrects for some of the problems we've talked about and doesn't perpetuate them?
I mean, for us, this is Neera. I think for us, the biggest lesson has been that engage both all their resources. And so sometimes the conversation just begins with the funding, but often these individuals have built very successful organizations themselves. And so engaging them on more than just money, I think encouraging them to wear sort of both their mind, invest both their mind and heart in their giving and approach. But I think that's a journey. Honestly, we've seen ultra high net worth, even high net worth, initially will start with storytelling. It has a lot to do with the relationships they begin to develop with these people. I think it rests upon us that are, you know, engaging with them to bring them in on as real partners and begin to expose them to the work. So encourage them to engage, to see, bring them into the community. And sometimes I think that's challenging, even as a community-based organization and even as a funder, to want to be out in the community. But I think that kind of exposure makes it much more real for what these organizations are dealing with. And then I find that that journey kind of begins.
Thanks so much for that. There's so much ground to cover here, and there were some questions we weren't able to get to. What I can commit to is sending these to our panelists and seeing if any of them have time to chime in as a follow-up. But in our last few minutes here, I always love to kick it back to our panelists for any final calls to action. So I can see from the questions coming in, we have a mix of donors and doers. We also have, people who are in dialogue with donors, and I should say both in philanthropy and I think larger bilaterals, multilaterals who might learn from some of this work happening in philanthropy. So given our audience, given their interest in this topic and their interest in bringing more proximity to philanthropy, any final calls to action you have? And maybe if it's okay, I'll start with Neera, and then we can hear from Rakesh and finally from Tim. Any final calls to action?
Yeah, I think mine really is, let's call each other out with respect and dignity, because I think part of our challenge is, some may have power, some may not, but I think those with power and privilege to be able to push this conversation and openness and hold each other accountable, I think will require us to call each other out.
Great. Thank you so much for that. I agree and appreciate what you all have done in this webinar in that way. Rakesh, you want to jump in with a final call to action?
Sure. First, I really love what Neera said, so I want to kind of say a big +1 to that. Look, I think we should, the action that I think is the most important needed from funders, and I think people in positions of privilege, is just to do more active and meaningful listening. And it's pat and easy to say that, but to kind of reflect that throughout our practice, how we organize our meetings, how we take our time, how we do site visits, the posture we take to avoid mansplaining or philanthrosplaining, I think is key. And one thing that I think would really show that we're doing this right is to make a commitment to write and share, let's say at least once a quarter, to answer the question, how have I changed my mind as a result of what I've learned from a program partner by listening? How am I changing my practice to be a better partner? Us committing to write that and specifically speak about how we're changing our practices would, I think, make the rubber hit the road, or put our money where our mouth is.
Agreed. Thank you so much for that. And Tim, we'll close with you here before I wrap it up. Any final call to action?
Well, I would just underline what both Neera and Rakesh have said, and note that doers, I think, have also a responsibility for respectfully disagreeing with donors and pushing back. I think sometimes doers are so eager to get the money that they play into the power dynamic and don't call out donors or don't push back donors where they see them not being learners or coming in with solutions just because they're just so eager to get the resources. So be ready to respectfully disagree with donors, to respectfully push back on donors. Do it with respect and do it with the expectation that the donor also wants to learn as part of the process.
Thanks so much. And I would just echo all of that, really useful insights from our panelists, and just say my call to action would be to keep this conversation going. So we've really just started it here in this webinar. We've tried to answer some of your questions. We'll get back to those we have not gotten back to. And I'll be writing a story pulling out some of the insights from this conversation in hopes of sharing them more broadly. Thank you all so much for joining us today. We've come to the end of our scheduled time. I wanted to let you know this webinar will be available to you once we end the live webcast, so you can come back and watch it. You can use these same links. We'll also be sending out a copy of the recording and a slide deck via email. And if you could just give us feedback by filling out a brief survey that will pop up when we're wrapped up here, we'd really appreciate it. Finally, huge thanks to our panelists, Neera, Rakesh, and Tim, dialing in from all over for sharing your insights and some ideas on the way forward with each of us. So thank you all, and good luck, and let's keep this conversation going.